Good evening, YouTube. What's going on? This is Pastor Matt, and welcome to the Daily Dose of Defense. For the next 6 days, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the truth behind the resurrection of Jesus and make an actual resurrection case so that we can see that Jesus was indeed resurrected. Once we can see that God exists and that He rose Jesus from the dead, we can see that the resurrection is the most important thing in our faith. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, is that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is the most important thing in our faith. And that's what he calls the gospel. So what we're going to do is I'm going to focus on 6 facts that are relatively undisputed amongst scholars. Now, these are people from the highest levels of education. These are people who are atheists, agnostics, as well as Christians who've studied the New Testament in lots of detail. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the crucifixion of Jesus. And there are 4 plus a few extra reasons to believe that Jesus was indeed crucified, put on a cross until he died around the eve before Passover. Now, the first thing we can look at is the early sources for this crucifixion accounts. Now, some people will tell you that the Bible was written many years after Jesus was crucified, many years after Jesus lived and taught, and how could they ever get it right? The first account of the crucifixion of Jesus happens in Galatians 3, when Paul writes, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified." Now, this was written about 20 years after the crucifixion. It's Paul's second or third letter, depending on how people date the letters. It was written in about 53. Now, this means that it is about the same time frame as if I were to write a story about what happened on September 11th of 2001. Now, the storyline and the time, I can remember what happened on September 11th, and I'm sure if you're watching this and you were alive for September 11th, you can too. Now, the problem is people want to say, well, that's too long, and the stories are too messed up by that point. But that's just not true, and we can see that in our own accounts of our lives and things we can remember. Now, the second is the Gospels. These are, they were written somewhere between 35 and 65 years after Jesus was crucified, with John being on the further end and Mark being on the nearer end. And that would be like me writing a book about the Reagan administration. Now, Luke says he did research for this. He interviewed people who were there. So it would be like me being able to interview people who were present during the Reagan administration and writing a book about it. So we can see that people's memories don't fade that quickly. They don't change that fast. The second is that it's recorded not only in Christian sources, but also in non-Christian sources. Now, in the Christian sources, the New Testament, each of the 4 Gospels record the actual crucifixion of Jesus and what happened on the cross. As well, we have Tacitus. He was a historian. He was a Roman historian who wrote the Annals of Rome, where he's recording the history of the Roman peoples. And he says that there was a man whom the Christians followed, who suffered the most extreme penalty during the reign of Emperor Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Then he talks about the fact that the superstition, it died down for a little bit, but then it resurged and it reached even to Rome. So that's what Tacitus wrote. But then there's a guy named Lucian. He's a little more clear with it. He's a Greek historian. And Lucian writes about Jesus having been crucified, and he actually uses the word for crucified in the area of Palestine. So we've got the right place, the right time, and the right cause of death that matches with what Christianity said. Now, Lucian was using sources in the archives, as was Tacitus. So these guys were able to use these archives to write their history books. Well, that tells us that at one point it was written in the archives. And if Tacitus, in other places, if he was unable to tell us where he got the information, he would say, this isn't verified, I haven't seen this, I don't know this to be true for sure, but this is what's reported. Then number 3 is we still have the eyewitnesses. The book of John was written by the Apostle John. He's not getting it secondhand. John talks about the fact that he was present at the cross when Jesus was crucified. So much so that Jesus even spoke to him. And he said, brother, this is your mother. Mother, this is your son. Right? So we know that John was there. And he wrote his own account of it. And he talks about the inscription that was put above Jesus' head. And he talks about every step and detail. So much so that it looks like an eyewitness account. And in John 19:20, he says that Jesus was crucified near the city. And then there's the embarrassment factor of this, right? All stories have certain factors to them which make them a little more believable, but the embarrassment factor is kind of the big factor here, because the embarrassment factor serves as showing us that, hey, here's this Messiah figure, this God figure, who is weak, he's bruised, he's beaten, and he's hanging on a cross, and he's crying out to God. And so we have that embarrassment there. Right? So those 4 facts show us that this most likely is true. Now, there are certain groups out there who say, oh, Jesus wasn't hung on a cross, he was hung from a pole. But the word in Greek is stauros. Now, stauros is used in Greek texts and Roman texts when they're writing in Greek, which for the longest time they were writing in Greek, and it means a cross, and the word used most often is apotumpanizo, which means to crucify on a plank. Right? If they were talking about an impaling, which we do see in Roman writings, they would have used the word anascolopito, which means to impale. Right? Also, within archaeology, we've seen recoveries of bodies. One of them, his name was Johanan, son of Hagakal. He had his ankles were nailed with a piece of wood between them. It's also reported, but not definitive, that he had scratches on the inside of his wrist, which were consistent with possible crucifixion. And then there's the Alexamenos inscription. Now, we don't know who Alexamenos was, but inside of a house that they have excavated, there is a picture of a being on a cross. Looks like with a donkey head. And it says, Alexamenos respects his God. It says, Alexamenos sebete theon. So when we look at that, we can see that it wasn't unheard of that a god would have been crucified, and they actually believe that Alexamenos is probably a Christian, and this is kind of poking fun at his Christianity. So we see that we have early sources for the crucifixion of Jesus. We have both Christian and non-Christian sources which talk about his crucifixion. We have eyewitness testimony to the crucifixion itself and the fact that the crucifixion would have been embarrassing. Then we have archaeological and word studies that also support Jesus having been crucified by the Romans at the behest of Pontius Pilate. That is your daily dose of defense. God bless.